Spanish man with just 600 soldiers somehow topples an empire of millions that had dominated Mesoamerica for centuries. Sounds impossible, right? Yet in 1519, Hernán Cortés did exactly that, changing the course of human history forever. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The real story of how Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire is far more complex, brutal, and fascinating than any Hollywood movie could ever capture. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most controversial figures, a man who's been called everything from a brilliant strategist to a genocidal monster. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a small band of Spanish conquistadors managed to bring down one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, and why this story still shapes our world today. Trust me, the truth is stranger than fiction. So who exactly was Hernán Cortés? Born in 1485 in the Spanish region of Extremadura, Cortés came from minor nobility. His family had some status, but little wealth. As a young man, he studied law at the University of Salamanca, but the classroom life wasn't for him. Like many ambitious young Spaniards of his era, Cortés was drawn to the New World by tales of gold and glory. In 1504, at just 19 years old, Cortés set sail for the Caribbean island of Hispaniola. This wasn't some grand expedition. He was basically a fortune seeker looking to make his mark in Spain's growing American colonies. For the next 15 years, he worked his way up through the colonial system, participating in the conquest of Cuba and building relationships with powerful figures like Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. But here's where things get interesting. By 1518, Cortés had established himself as a successful colonist with encomiendas, basically land grants that came with indigenous laborers. He was wealthy, well-connected, and respected. Yet something inside him craved more. When reports reached Cuba about a mysterious and wealthy civilization on the Mexican mainland, Cortés saw his opportunity for immortality. The Aztec Empire that Cortés would soon encounter was nothing like the primitive societies that Europeans had previously met in the Caribbean. We're talking about a sophisticated civilization that controlled much of central Mexico through a complex system of tribute and alliances. The capital city of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, was one of the largest cities in the world at that time, with an estimated population of 200,000 to 300,000 people. The Aztecs had developed remarkable engineering, including floating gardens called chinampas, massive stone pyramids, and an intricate system of canals and causeways connecting their island capital to the mainland. They had a complex calendar system, sophisticated mathematics, and a writing system using pictographs. This wasn't some primitive society waiting to be civilized. This was a major world power with its own rich culture, military, might, and territorial ambitions. But the Aztec Empire also had a significant weakness that Cortés would soon exploit. It was built on the domination of numerous tributary peoples who harbored deep resentments against their Aztec overlords. Many of these subjugated groups were forced to pay heavy tributes in goods, labor, and human lives for religious sacrifices. This created a powder keg of ethnic tensions that a clever outsider could potentially ignite. Now let's talk about how Cortés managed to get his expedition off the ground. In 1518, Governor Velázquez commissioned Cortés to lead an expedition to explore and trade with the Mexican mainland. But as departure time approached, Velázquez became suspicious that Cortés had ambitions beyond mere exploration and trade. the governor tried to revoke Cortés's commission, but it was too late. Cortés had already gathered his men, supplies, and ships. In February 1519, Cortés deliberately defied his orders and set sail from Cuba with approximately 600 men, 16 horses, and several cannons. This wasn't just insubordination. It was outright rebellion against the Spanish colonial government. Cortés was essentially betting his life that he could achieve something so spectacular that the Spanish crown would forgive his disobedience and reward him for his success. The first challenge came almost immediately. When Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico, he faced a critical decision that would define his entire campaign. Rather than maintaining an escape route, he ordered his men to scuttle most of their ships. The message was clear. There would be no retreat, no going back to Cuba with their tails between their legs. They would either conquer this new land or die trying. This dramatic gesture had a profound psychological effect on his men. With no ships to carry them home, they had no choice but to follow Cortés forward into the unknown. But it also demonstrated something crucial about Cortés's character. He was willing to take enormous risks and commit completely to his goals, even when the odds seemed impossible. The early encounters with indigenous peoples along the Mexican coast gave Cortés his first major advantages. After defeating the Tabascans in battle, he received tribute that included 20 women, one of whom would change the course of history. Her name was Malinche, though the Spanish called her Doña Marina. She spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and she quickly learned Spanish. Malinche became far more than just an interpreter for Cortés. She became his strategic advisor, diplomatic intermediary, and eventually his lover. Her knowledge of local politics, customs, and languages was absolutely crucial to Cortés's success. Some historians argue that without Malinche, Cortés never could have navigated the complex political landscape of Mesoamerica. She helped him understand which groups were enemies of the Aztecs and could potentially become allies. As Cortés moved inland, he encountered the Tlaxcalans, a confederation of city-states that had successfully resisted Aztec domination for decades. Initially, the Tlaxcalans fought against the Spanish, but after several battles, their leaders made a calculated decision that would reshape the Americas. They chose to ally with these strange foreign warriors against their hated Aztec enemies. This alliance was absolutely crucial to Cortés's eventual success. The Tlaxcalans didn't just provide thousands of warriors. They offered local knowledge, supply lines, and most importantly, legitimacy among other indigenous groups who opposed Aztec rule. Suddenly, Cortés wasn't just leading a small band of foreign invaders. He was commanding a growing coalition of indigenous allies who saw the Spanish as a potential path to freedom from Aztec oppression. But Cortés faced a major problem: his own legal status. He was technically a rebel who had defied the governor of Cuba and had no official authorization from the Spanish crown for his conquest. To solve this, Cortés employed a brilliant legal maneuver. He established the settlement of Veracruz and had his men elect him as Captain General and Chief Magistrate. Then, acting in this capacity, he sent representatives directly to King Charles III of Spain with a detailed report of his discoveries and a generous portion of the treasure he had already acquired. This end run around the colonial bureaucracy was risky but clever. Instead of going through Governor Velázquez, who wanted to arrest him, Cortés appealed directly to the highest authority in the Spanish Empire. His message was simple: "I've found an incredibly wealthy civilization. I'm in the process of conquering it for Spain. and here's a sample of the riches that await your royal approval. As news of the Spanish presence spread throughout the region, Cortés received an invitation that seemed almost too good to be true. Moctezuma II, the Aztec Emperor, invited the Spanish to visit Tenochtitlan as honored guests. This invitation puzzled many of Cortés' men, but the conquistador saw it as an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The march to Tenochtitlan took the Spanish and their indigenous allies through diverse terrain and numerous cities. Along the way, Cortés continued to gather intelligence about Aztec military capabilities, political structures, and potential weaknesses. He also continued to recruit allies, particularly in the city of Cholula, where he massacred thousands of inhabitants after claiming to discover a plot against his forces. This massacre at Cholula revealed another crucial aspect of Cortés' strategy: the calculated use of terror. By demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of Spanish weapons and their willingness to use extreme violence, Cortés sent a message throughout the region. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force, while cooperation would be rewarded with protection and a share in the spoils of conquest. When the Spanish finally approached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were stunned by what they saw. The great causeway leading across the lake to the island city, the massive pyramids rising above the urban landscape, the thousands of canoes moving through the canals. It was unlike anything Europeans had ever encountered. Bernal Diaz, one of Cortés' soldiers, later wrote that it seemed like something from a dream. The initial meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma was one of the most dramatic encounters in human history. Here were the representatives of two completely different worlds, each trying to understand and manipulate the other. Moctezuma received the Spanish with great ceremony, housing them in a palace within the city and showering them with gifts of gold and precious objects. But why did Moctezuma allow these foreigners into his capital? The answer involves a complex mix of diplomacy, religious beliefs, and political calculation. Some sources suggest that Moctezuma initially believed Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, though this interpretation is disputed by modern historians. More likely, Moctezuma was following established diplomatic protocols for receiving foreign dignitaries while trying to assess the threat and opportunities these strangers represented. Cortés, meanwhile, was gathering intelligence about the city's defenses, wealth, and political structure. After just a few days in Tenochtitlan, he made one of the boldest moves in military history. He took Moctezuma prisoner in his own palace. Using a combination of psychological pressure and veiled threats, Cortés convinced the emperor to become his prisoner and to rule through Spanish direction. This audacious kidnapping worked initially because of the highly hierarchical nature of Aztec society. With their emperor apparently cooperating with the Spanish, many Aztec nobles were uncertain how to respond. Moctezuma continued to issue orders, but now those orders served Spanish interests rather than Aztec ones. For several months, this bizarre arrangement actually functioned. Cortés ruled Tenochtitlan through his captive, emperor, extracting enormous amounts of gold and other treasures while maintaining a facade of Moctezuma's continued authority. The Spanish melted down priceless works of Aztec art to create portable gold bars, destroying in the process artifacts that represented centuries of sophisticated craftsmanship. But this fragile situation couldn't last forever. In early 1520, Cortés received disturbing news from the coast. Governor Velázquez had sent a force under Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest Cortés and bring him back to Cuba for trial. Faced with this threat to his rear, Cortés made another calculated gamble. He left a garrison under Pedro de Alvarado to hold Tenochtitlan and march to the coast with most of his men. The confrontation with Narvaez demonstrated Cortés's political skills as much as his military abilities. Rather than simply fighting Narvaez's larger force, Cortés used bribery, propaganda, and surprise to win over many of Narvaez's soldiers. He convinced them that following him offered better prospects for wealth and glory than arresting him on behalf of a distant governor. After a brief battle in which Narvaez lost an eye, most of his force joined Cortés's expedition. But while Cortés was away dealing with Narvaez, disaster struck in Tenochtitlan. During a religious festival, Alvarado and his men massacred hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles, claiming they feared an attack. This brutal act shattered any remaining trust between the Spanish and the Aztecs and sparked a citywide uprising. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan with his reinforced army, he found the city in open rebellion. The Spanish were trapped in their palace compound, under constant attack from thousands of angry warriors. The situation was desperate, and Cortés made a fatal miscalculation. He forced Moctezuma to address his people from the palace walls, hoping the emperor could calm the uprising. Instead, the sight of their captive ruler trying to pacify them for his Spanish captors enraged the Aztec people even further. Stones and arrows flew toward the palace walls, and Moctezuma was mortally wounded. Though whether by his own people's projectiles or by Spanish weapons remains disputed by historians. With Moctezuma's death, Cortés lost his primary tool for controlling the Aztec Empire. The night of June 30th, 1520, became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cortés attempted to evacuate his forces from Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness, but Aztec warriors discovered the retreat and attacked in force. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers died, along with thousands of their indigenous allies. Much of the treasure they had accumulated was lost in the lake as men weighted down with gold drowned trying to escape. Cortés himself barely survived, and his expedition seemed finished. But this is where his true character showed through. Rather than accepting defeat and retreating to the coast, Cortés regrouped his surviving forces and began planning his return. He established a base in Tlaxcalan territory and started building a new strategy based on siege warfare rather than occupation. The key to Cortés's comeback was naval power on Lake Texcoco. He had his men construct a fleet of small sailing ships called brigantines, designed specifically for warfare on the lake. These ships would allow him to cut off Tenochtitlan from the mainland and control all water-based supply routes to the island city. But building these ships required European shipbuilding techniques in the middle of Mexico. Cortés had to transport equipment and materials across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. His men had to cut timber, forge metal fittings, and weave sails, all while maintaining their military operations against Aztec forces. Meanwhile, smallpox had begun spreading through the indigenous population with devastating effect. This disease, brought by the Europeans, but affecting primarily the native peoples who had no immunity, killed a significant portion of Tenochtitlan's population. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor, who had organized the resistance that drove out the Spanish. The new Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was a young war leader determined to fight the Spanish to the end. Unlike Moctezuma, he had no illusions about Spanish intentions and prepared the city for a siege. Under his leadership, the Aztecs strengthened their defenses, stockpiled supplies, and reached out to potential allies throughout the region. By early 1521, Cortés was ready to begin his siege of Tenochtitlan. His force had grown dramatically, with thousands of indigenous allies from groups that had suffered under Aztec rule. The siege would last for several months and become one of the most brutal campaigns in the history of the Americas. The Spanish strategy was methodical and devastating. Using their brigantines to control the lake, they cut off all supply routes to the city. Then they began a systematic conquest of the city, advancing block by block, destroying buildings and filling in canals to deny the defenders their mobility advantages. The Aztecs fought with remarkable courage and determination. They adapted their tactics to counter Spanish advantages, using obsidian-tipped weapons to devastating effect in close combat and employing psychological warfare to demoralize their enemies. But they faced impossible odds. Disease had weakened their population, their allies had largely abandoned them, and they lacked the technological advantages of their enemies. The siege reached its climax in August 1521. After months of fighting, the surviving defenders were concentrated in the final districts of the city. Starvation and disease had taken a terrible toll, but Cuauhtémoc and his warriors continued to resist. The final assault was brutal, with Spanish and indigenous forces showing little mercy to the remaining defenders. When Cuauhtémoc was finally captured on August 13, 1521, the Aztec Empire effectively ceased to exist. The great city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, its population decimated by war, disease, and starvation. Cortés had achieved what seemed impossible just 2 years earlier: the conquest of one of the world's great empires with a handful of European soldiers. The aftermath of the conquest was complex and tragic. Cortés became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the Spanish Empire, receiving vast encomiendas and noble titles. But his relationship with the Spanish crown remained complicated. While they rewarded his success, they also feared his independence and gradually stripped away much of his political power. For the indigenous peoples of Mexico, the conquest was an unmitigated catastrophe. Beyond the immediate deaths from warfare, diseases brought by Europeans continued to devastate the population for decades. Traditional political, social, and religious structures were destroyed or fundamentally altered. The rich cultural heritage of Mesoamerica was largely suppressed in favor of Spanish colonial systems. Yet Cortés's legacy extends far beyond the immediate conquest. His success opened Central and South America to Spanish colonization, leading to the extraction of enormous wealth that would fund Spanish power in Europe for centuries. The cultural mixing that followed the conquest created the complex mestizo societies that characterize much of Latin America today. The story of Cortés also raises profound questions about historical interpretation. Was he a brilliant military strategist who achieved the impossible? Or was he simply lucky to arrive at a moment when disease and political divisions made the Aztec Empire vulnerable? Was he an agent of progress bringing European civilization to the Americas? Or was he a destroyer of rich indigenous cultures? Modern historians tend to emphasize that Cortés's success depended heavily on indigenous allies who had their own reasons for opposing Aztec rule. Rather than a simple story of European superiority, the conquest emerges as a complex political and military campaign in which various indigenous groups played crucial roles. The technological advantages that helped Cortés, steel weapons, firearms, horses, and ships, were significant but not overwhelming. More important were political factors. The Aztec Empire's reliance on tributary relationships that created potential allies for any challenger, the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations, and Cortés's own political and military skills. Understanding Cortés requires seeing him as a product of his time, while also recognizing his exceptional abilities. He was ruthless, ambitious, and willing to use extreme violence to achieve his goals, characteristics that were unfortunately common among conquistadors. But he was also a skilled diplomat, strategic thinker, and military leader who succeeded where others might have failed. The conquest of the Aztec Empire remains one of history's most dramatic examples of how a small, determined force can achieve seemingly impossible goals under the right circumstances. It demonstrates the importance of political alliances, technological advantages, and simple historical timing in shaping the course of human events. Today, Cortés remains a controversial figure throughout the Spanish-speaking world. In Mexico, he is largely remembered as a destroyer of indigenous civilization, while in Spain, he is sometimes celebrated as a great explorer and conquistador. This split reflects the lasting impact of his actions and the complex legacy of European colonialism in the Americas. The story of Hernán Cortés and the conquest of the Aztec Empire continues to fascinate us because it represents such a dramatic turning point in world history. In just 2 years, a small group of Spanish adventurers fundamentally altered the course of 2 continents, setting in motion changes that continue to shape our world today. Whether you see Cortés as hero or villain, there's no denying that his story reveals something profound about human ambition, the unpredictability of history, and the devastating consequences that can follow when different civilizations collide. The boy from Extremadura, who dreamed of glory, achieved immortality, but at a price that the indigenous peoples of the Americas are still paying today.